everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for a conversation on the art of the interesting with Lorraine Besser and Shoshana Simons. My name's Izzy. I am the Public Events Manager for California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a nonprofit university in San Francisco on the unceded ancestral lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. As a representative of CIIS, I want to acknowledge that our campus is located on Yelamu, which is the Ramaytush word for both the people and the territory of what we know as the San Francisco Peninsula. This acknowledgement is just one small way that we honor our gratitude and our debt to the Indigenous caretakers of the land where we live and work. And we invite you to call out in the chat who the Indigenous caretakers are of the lands where you're located at this moment, since we're gathered on this online space. But if you're early in your journey and would like a starting resource to learn more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we recommend the website native-land.ca. Now, before we start, I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight, so please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. Our presenters will pull questions from that form after the event, and we'll try to get to as many as we have time for. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event. But if you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You could turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find that it is negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having trouble with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you still have issues, we suggest that you adjust your video settings from within YouTube. Now, let me first introduce our presenters and we'll get right to the conversation. Shoshana Simons, PhD and registered drama therapist, is a professor and former program chair of CIIS's MA in Counseling Psychology, Expressive Arts concentration, where she teaches family and couple dynamics, multicultural counseling and the therapeutic relationship, and narrative expressive arts family therapy. She is also an arts-based coach and consultant and a sacred rebel, embracing the principles of improvisation into all aspects of her life. She has 35 plus years of experience working with diverse children and adults in the fields of education, anti-racism, counseling psychology, organizational development, and community work. Lorraine Besser is a philosopher and professor at Middlebury College who specializes in happiness and well-being, which she considers from an interdisciplinary perspective. She's the author of 2 academic books, The Philosophy of Happiness, An Interdisciplinary Introduction, and Eudaimonic Ethics, The Philosophy and Psychology of Living Well. She was a founding investigator on the research team studying psychological richness. The Art of the Interesting is her first trade book. And now, let me turn it over to Lorraine and Shoshana.
Hi, Lorraine. Good evening.
Hi, thank you for having me here. This is exciting to do.
You are so welcome. So we had one opportunity to meet and have a phone conversation before the fact, which in itself was really interesting. Here we are in the Bay Area. You're in Vermont, where I used to live. And I'm hearing you got a heat wave going on there.
Yes, yes.
But your book also brought me to the shore of Lake Champlain, which I really appreciated reading about.
Oh, good.
And
yeah.
I was really delighted to be invited to interview you about your book, a lot because of being drawn by the title, The Art of the Interesting. As you know, I work in expressive arts therapy, and so much of what I was learning from reading your book, which is like, and I want to really ask you, I'm so curious about this intersection between philosophy and psychology, but also between the use of the word art, which you capitalized as well, the art of the interesting. That's a juxtaposition of art and interesting. And I'd love for our conversation tonight to be a practice in the art of the interesting, to take us somewhere where we maybe haven't gone before. We could invite that in. So
Yeah,
just to
thank you.
begin, yeah. So maybe just start right there. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in philosophy and the impetus behind this particular book?
Yeah, so I'm trained in a Western analytic tradition of philosophy, and very early in my career, I was focusing on questions and looking at them from really a historical perspective. I was focusing on questions like what motivates us to act well, how it is that we should behave towards one another. And at a certain point, I just started thinking that, psychologists probably have something to say about this that I should be reading. And from that point on, I really developed this style of doing philosophy that takes psychological research and more generally the social sciences as a real starting point for understanding human behavior. And then as a philosopher, what I do is try to move beyond the descriptive accounts that we get from the social scientists and explore the questions that are normative, that have these oughts. And so the question of how we ought to live, for example, is one of these things. So that's my background. And the current project that we're discussing here, it started a few years ago. It was right before the pandemic, and a psychologist, Dr. Shige Oshii, who was at the time at the University of Virginia, he reached out to me. He was familiar with some of my work, and he reached out to me, thinking that I'm trying to figure out who was missing this. We were all missing it, thinking that in all of the work that both philosophers and psychologists had done about the good life, we were still missing something really important. And he had this idea that there was this set of experiences that have this particular impact on our minds. So they're stimulating this really kind of robust form of cognitive engagement. And that these were a unique set of experiences and that they delivered something unique to us. And his first point of contact really came at the right time for me. I had both professionally and personally been through worked on questions about meaningfulness and using our rational capacities. And I'd really found myself, certainly personally, at a point where I just really pushed those capacities very hard and was feeling burnt and impoverished by it. At the same time, I had just written this book on happiness, which I found so interesting and so rewarding to write. But at the same time, I really walked away from that experiencing, understanding that happiness actually plays a more limited role in our lives than I had certainly thought. So the suggestion when Shige came to me, the suggestion that, maybe we've all missed something and maybe it looks like this was one that really spoke to me. And so we worked together and we started this research project trying to isolate these set of experiences and understand how they contributed to our lives.
Mm. So I'm so curious. I'm not I'm not a philosopher. That's not my background. And I just want, just for the audience, because I'm sure our audience has got different levels of understanding and experience with Western philosophy. I'm wondering if you can define these three key concepts that underpin your research. And you already used the term the good life. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean by the good life, the meaningful life, and psychological richness? So that as we go through, we can keep referring back and have some common understanding of that.
Yes, thank you. Excellent place to start. I understand the good life, and I'm working within a tradition of understanding the good life as a life that is full of really valuable experiences. So I'm not approaching the good life as, what do we need to do, or what do we need to obtain or achieve, but I'm really trying to think about it in terms of like, well, what are the best kinds of things for us to experience or the best kinds of experiences for us to have. And so I'm really looking at the good life in terms of this experiential level of what kinds of valuable experiences make up a good life. And so the meaningful life or meaningfulness, so that tracks a certain kind of experiences that we have that use the rational structure of our minds, right? We're using our minds to learn, to find our purpose, to create purpose, to achieve. And that kind of a life, or that kind of those range of experiences, are really distinctive, I think, insofar as they're using this aspect of our minds that we're all familiar with, right? It's very structured, very rational, and it's searching for something and striving. Psychological richness, on the other hand, right? It's still using our mind, but it's using a whole different part of our mind. And that's what I think is really exciting about this. Psychological richness describes the particular impact a set of experiences has on our mind. So experiences that tend to be challenging, complex, novel. When we have these kinds of experiences, our mind reacts to them in a certain way. And psychological richness describes how our minds react, the impact these experiences have upon our being. So the particular impact that they have is really stimulating this robust form of cognitive engagement that involves new thoughts, that stimulate new emotions, that stimulate more thoughts, and that often really leave us with a changed perspective as a result. So the kind of experiences, right? And I think they feel interesting. That's how I describe that. They're the kind of experiences, they feel interesting, and they're the ones that really do have this dent upon us. And so that when we walk away, we just find ourselves moved and impacted. And so we set out to figure out that these were a discrete set of experiences, right? That they were different than meaningful ones, and also different than happiness, and that they were valuable experiences, so that they were an important part of the good life.
So how did you go about investigating that? How did you do that kind of empirical data gathering?
Yeah, it's a really, even when I describe it, I'm like, it's really amazing how we can work together in these ways. And so the start was to really try to navigate the scope of these experiences and to make sure that they weren't covered in these other very familiar parts of the good life. And so what we wanted to do then was to try to show that these were experiences that were separate from happy ones, or that were separate from the kinds of things that delivered happiness, and also separate from meaningful ones. And that doesn't mean they don't overlap, right? So of course, many experiences can be valuable in all of these ways. But the important thing was that they tracked something distinct and different. And so we set about to show that from an empirical and from a theoretical perspective, and to show that they are empirically distinct. And I'm following Shige here. I was a philosopher on the team, and it was a really great experience. And but what fundamentally what the research involved was creating a scale of psychological richness by which we would suggest to people, like, how often have you had like a novel experience or a complex emotions and unusual experiences. So we're trying to develop a scale through which we could measure or gauge psychological richness, and then compare it to the scales that were already existent at the time, that tracked happiness and meaningfulness. And so they crunch the data on that and find that they are just actually tracking something distinct, so that this idea of psychological richness and as this overall impact of these experiences, that was something new and distinct, and honestly that philosophers and psychologists have just overlooked for so long. As the philosopher on the team, I set about helping to carve out this concept and to show like how it needed to be really where the theoretical boundaries lay of psychological richness versus happiness and meaningfulness. And so that got me started thinking about, why psychologically rich experiences are valuable. And that really directed my attention to where it is now, which is on this notion of the interesting, which I take to be basically how these experiences feel on the inside when we're experiencing them. So that tracks, how they're distinct. And, the second part of this research, though, is to try to show that they're valuable, right? Not that it's just this distinct set of stuff, but to show that they're valuable. And this is something that is difficult to show from a psychological perspective. It's one of these normative kind of claims that's difficult to show empirically. But the empirical research that we did suggested that at least that people valued it, right? So we would ask people, like, after kind of getting them to think about psychological richness and understanding its differences, we would ask, well, which kind of life would you choose for yourself, right? And we found that a lot of people did want to choose this psychologically rich life. And we've also found further evidence, and I particularly enjoyed these kinds of studies. Were obituary studies and looking at obituaries of what people report as, the highlights of one's life. And we found a lot of, evidence of psychological
Interesting.
richness in these
Yeah.
obituaries. Yeah, I thought that was
Wow.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If folks wanted to know more about the actual methodology, has this research been published?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a co-authored paper by myself and Oshi that was called The Psychologically Rich Life. And so that came out in 2019. And then there's a paper that does more of the psychology by Oshi and Westgate that is Beyond Happiness and Meaning, The Psychologically Rich Life. And that details a lot more the correlations that they're discovering and how, the fine tuning of how they're figuring out this distinct category.
Maybe we can have that in the notes after
Yeah.
the presentation for folks that might want to follow up on that. And as I'm listening to you, I'm seeing how animated you become when talking about psychological richness. And I've got a curiosity coming myself now, which is what was your experience of psychological richness through being on this team, being in this cross-disciplinary team? I'm just curious to know what that was like for you.
Yeah, it really did tap into you do a lot of self-searching on these kinds of when you're working on these things and you're thinking about the role that these different kinds of experiences have in your life. And I really found that actually this described a part of me that had been way neglected and buried in, the process of getting tenure and doing all of this stuff. And so it really did resonate with me that this was something that was really important and did really animate me and define me. And yet it really gotten buried throughout all of the adulting. And so thinking about this from this perspective was really affirming of myself and my own experiences, but also affirming of that, we're talking about something really important here that we didn't discover the new thing, but by talking about it and by framing it and talking about why it's valuable and how you can harness its value, we're really, I think it's offering a very empowering framework for us to seize life.
So in hearing that, I am so curious to know what's transforming you as a researcher through the art of the interesting. And there's so many other questions I want to ask you about the book, but I can't help but ask that one.
Yeah. So what's transforming me as a researcher? Well, I personally find myself very liberated from the framework that had been working in for a very long time, right? So that's, conversations about the good life have gone on for centuries, and there is emerging a pretty stable dichotomy between like this meaningful stuff and happiness, and I felt like it left me out a little bit, like, and I wasn't doing very well in either of those. And so I felt left out. And so, I really feel like because this speaks so much to me, I was really able to bring myself and my own experiences uh, and draw on my environment and to talk about all of the ways in which I find the interesting in my life and to really try to kind of understand and seize how we can all look out on our lives regardless of what's going on in them and really find them more interesting and even create more interesting experiences.
Fascinating. Yeah, as I was reading, I was reading it through my academic lens through being at CIIS, and I think we touched on this conversation about what's different about CIIS from, I'd lived on the East Coast, and I know Middlebury and I know CIIS, and thinking about contexts and what different contexts enable And CIIS with that word integral, is very much about putting the pieces together. And you told me that at one point you'd been interested maybe in applying for CIIS, and
Yeah.
found that fascinating. And thinking about the gift to our students when we as professors or academics open up our own path, what that may out of the constraints and the oppressive structures of academia, when you take that courageous risk to investigate, right, to get into that cross-disciplinary relationship with a psychologist, and chart a new path, what becomes possible for your students, in making in their psychological richness and in what they might be able to do to further that research in their own lives.
Yeah, thank you. And another way in which this experience has really opened me up or brought more of myself to the research is through writing a trade book, which is a very different experience. And, it's one, it was so rewarding for me, but, it's also very different. I have to, be vulnerable, bring my own self into the picture, really, and discuss many of my experiences, a way of illustrating the kind of what we're after here. And so that, and I do find that in the classroom that is more helpful, right? To just have let down your guards and really just to be able to integrate without boundaries, and to just get to what counts. And so that's been really great.
That's wonderful. That kind of brings me to mind. I'm looking here because I do have a lot of questions I really want to ask you, and I keep wanting to also follow. But you discussed the role of creativity in the art of the interesting, and I'm very interested in creativity, and I know you had some different ways of defining it. How do you define it, and how would you know? How would anyone know they're having creativity, having a creative moment? How would you know it was happening? How did you know it was happening?
Yeah. I grew up being taught that, people had right brains and left brains, and, you were either creative or not. And I was definitely not creative on those angles. But, what we're learning and what we now know about creativity, it's really just all about forging new ground and being willing to shift your boundaries and to disrupt your thought patterns and to really get to some place different or new. So it's about building connections and even building connections between, these different sides of your brain and bringing things together. So that I find really empowering, right? Because it meant to me, it means that, because I'm not an artist. I'm really not even good at imaginative play. I struggled with that a lot as a parent. I was like, but to me, this is really kind of a liberating way to look about creativity, because it shows that we're all creative and that all we have to do is to try something new and to really just see what happens. And we don't have to be, also, like, when we're being creative, this was also liberating. We don't have to be good at it, right? We just have to be creative, and that's really in the spirit of what we're after here. And so I think that, we're all coming from a different point of view with respect to our thinking about ourselves and our degrees of creativity. But I think if we are more open to just recognizing when we are doing something creative, and even for me, it helps to label it, to be like, yeah, that was a creative way to cook dinner tonight. I don't know how well it tasted, but it was creative because I had nothing in the fridge. And so little bits like that of just recognizing when you have been creative and then appreciating it and allowing it to immerse yourself more.
Right, that's really lovely. So, following on from that, I'm curious about the connections you have noted between psychological richness, the art of the interesting, and what you're referring to as mindfulness 2.0. And I'd love you to unpack what that is, because people have a lot of associations with mindfulness.
Yes, we do. But that's why this is 2.0.
Yeah.
But yeah. So psychological richness, right? Think about it. It's all about allowing yourself to engage your mind, right? And to either stimulate your mind or to let it flow some way or another. And so, and part of the art of the interesting, you seized on that word art before, and I really like that title. I mean, I really captured something with this idea of it being an art, because there's no list of to-dos, but it's a skill that we can develop, that we can bring to things. And one of the most important things that I think we can bring is this kind of form of noticing, right? That's what I'm getting at with Mindfulness 2.0, a way of using the skills that are many of us are familiar with of mindfulness, where typically when we understand mindfulness, it's about bringing our attention inside of our mind, right? Developing this metacognitive awareness of our thought patterns and sitting with those in a really non-judgmental, non-evaluative way. And my idea and what I'm suggesting here is that we can take that same frame of basic mindfulness and just extend it outside, so that we are noticing things in our environment, picking up on things without all of this preconceived baggage and evaluations interfering. And I think that's one of the most, the first kind of core feature of tapping into this art is just being able to notice things and to let your mind just go with that. So often we bring so much to our, engagements into our world, and we judge it. We think it's one thing, we think it's good, we think it's bad. And, it's so nice to just be able to let go of that evaluative framework and just to see what you can notice. By noticing something, you introduce novelty to your life, to your mind, and then you're gonna, that's really shown to be effective in stimulating psychological richness. And it's a very, it can be hard, but once you can do it, right? Like everyone can just go out there and just try to notice something and see what they can notice without judging, without classifying, and just bring an open mind to it. And so, yeah, the Mindfulness 2.0 is about taking that same kind of thing we normally turn inside and just turning it outside.
In your book, you give some very specific kinds of opportunities to reflect. And I wonder if you could maybe invite you to read one of your practices for developing more of
Oh,
that.
yes.
Yeah, Mindfulness 2.0.
Yeah, sure. Try to figure out.
In fact, you call it developing an arousal.
Yeah.
Optimal arousal.
Yeah.
Which also has interesting language.
Yeah, let me set that up a little bit, and then
Yes,
I'll read it for
do.
you. Yeah, so optimal arousal. I'm drawing from the social sciences on this account, but it's really capturing, I think, very well what we're after here, and we're thinking about engagement. And so it's going to optimal arousal really is describing this state according, in which you are engaged, and so not under aroused, right? And yet not over aroused to the point where you really can't open your mind to having these kind of free flowing thoughts. So we're looking for this sweet spot, right, of optimal arousal. And I think that when we notice things from this, within this sweet spot, then we're on our way to going it. But with many of these tips and practices I give, they're really practices through which we can learn how these things feel for ourselves, right? Because we're all having, what counts as interesting is different for everyone. It's an experience. Optimal arousal is a very, it's something that is unique to each of us. So the key here is to really wrap your heads and practice what getting used to what these feel like. Right? All right, so here's the section on discovering your state of optimal arousal. So if you've got a mind, you know what it feels like to be under and overstimulated. It's time to zero in on those states so that you can better predict when you'll find your state of optimal arousal. Or in other words, learn how to set the state to engage the interesting, set the stage to engage the interesting. So pick your favorite leisure activity, right? Whether it's playing a video game, reading a book, learning something new, listening to a podcast, right? It doesn't have to be anything lofty, and it certainly doesn't have to be like intellectual, but something that requires thought, right? We're engaging our minds here, and something that you tend to enjoy. Now that you've got that activity in mind, right? The next task is to carve out these instances of reading books, playing games, and so on, right? Carve out instances when first, right, this activity left you completely unengaged. You may have done it, but you got nothing from it, right? It was understimulating, boring even. Second, this activity overwhelmed you to the point where you couldn't engage in it, right? Maybe you gave up, or maybe you pushed through only to find yourself worn out. And then third, this activity felt engaging, activating, and invigorating, leaving you wanting more in a good way. So these are your states of under, over, and optimal arousal. Notice how they make you feel, especially that state of optimal arousal. And if you can take this one step further and identify what it is that triggers these states in yourself, right, you get bonus points. And if you can't, don't stress, right? It's the states that count. And the more familiar you are with them, the more you can recognize how to shape your activities so that they deliver optimal arousal.
Thank you. So, yeah, as I was thinking about that, and you go there right after talking about optimal arousal, you discuss safety zones and danger zones, and that just seems to totally rationally follow on from that. And I was thinking about that in terms of living in such scary, beautiful worlds, joyous worlds, interesting worlds, but we also live in a very oppressive world, a very stratified world, and that is very unequal. The kinds of stresses people face are very linked to social class, race, gender, age, discrimination, social oppression, and just like managing to get through everyday life. So I'm wondering if you could talk to the relevance of these practices that are interesting within the context of social oppression and our individual and collective nervous systems.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. There's so much of what I talk about is finding this balance between, getting out there, all right, without really getting to this point where you're overstimulated, or you're in your danger zone. And I think that one of the things that we find that I think is really important here is that when we have these kind of psychologically rich experiences, we're really engaging all kind of areas of our mind. And one thing that the research shows is that over time, this allows us to experience a more expansive sense of self, right? So I think so often when we're in these circumstances, right, of very unsettling conditions and, suffering from unequal social positions, very often it's really uprooting one's sense of self and calling into question, right, any kind what agency anyone might have. And so one interesting thing I think that happens once we start to embrace psychological richness and to incorporate into our lives is that we develop this kind of expanded sense of self because we're more connected, right? We're engaging different parts of our mind, and it leaves us with a more feeling connected to the world. And so we don't have studies on certainly on oppression, but there is this sense that the research has uncovered about how you develop a greater sense of a connection and agency within the world, right? So somehow it feels less ambiguous, less uncertain, because you're in touch with them. And so I think that this will help us to feel more grounded, right? And to keep us grounded, certainly in kind of situations of vulnerability. So I think that there is a way to develop here through engaging in psychologically rich experiences to expand oneself and to root oneself even more than. And I think there's a large part of recognizing that we all have this capacity within ourselves to enhance our lives without changing our circumstances, and without, making the world a perfect place, right? So we still have this ability just within ourselves, no matter what position we are, to enhance our lives, and, independently of our social positions, independently of the circumstances that we can't change, we can still have this ability to live well, and to embrace life fully in a way that is in our control. So I think those can be really important. And one place I go to repeatedly in the book is to think about the value of being able to use your mind to engage your mind in this way that begets interesting experiences, to have that capacity to do it, and even under horrific circumstances when you have no control or no no ability to move around in this world. So I think we're familiar with this point. Viktor Frankl made it really well.
Yeah.
This idea of just like we even, you know, when we're completely oppressed, right, we can obtain spiritual freedom, and that in many instances is a lifesaver, right? A lifesaver. And what we're looking at here, this capacity to have interesting experiences, right? It's a parallel freedom of mind, and it is something that's always available. My favorite story that,
I'm hearing you. I mean, the word you invoking Viktor Frankl. I was just thinking about Viktor Frankl as you were speaking, and the idea of spiritual freedom. And I'm, you know, again thinking about CIIS and having it being a location where we have a lot of not just permission, encouragement to integrate the spiritual dimension into our research and into our teaching. And I'd love to hear more about that, where your own thinking goes in relation to the spiritual dimension beyond the psychological languaging.
yeah,
Where,
you know,
what you're sensing into from that point of view.
I think that tapping into a spiritual place where you are able to connect with something greater, where you are able to find freedom, that's a that's a great, I mean, that I don't even know what the words for that are, right? But that's an empowering, enhancing skill, and one that can very much enrich our lives. And I I think that those who have that spiritual connection, and that those who can find that place spiritually, will find a lot of points of connection here between what I'm encouraging here, which is less spiritually grounded, but still very much seeking within our minds to make the world better. And so I think that the background, you know, that I'm grounded in conversation with these social scientists, and you know, one of the things that we're after when we're thinking about this good life are intrinsic values that are good for everybody, and that everybody responds to. And you know, I do think that it can be difficult for some to engage in that spiritual way, and I think that and it all takes practice and development, and there are resources, of course, right? But I think this is a, you know, this can be a parallel experience that will really enhance your life, even when these other options aren't really an option.
Yeah. So you also expanding that sort of circle beyond the individual. You talk about friendship, and I wonder if you can, and relationships. Can you say a little bit more about what you were exploring in the book in relation to the importance of relationships and the potential of relationships, and how that relates to what you're finding out about psychological richness?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I loved writing that chapter. I got to write about all of my connections and really explore what it is that we can, how connections or friendships, just to use one word, how friendships really do enhance our lives. Part of what, you know, I take on in that chapter is, you know, we hear over and over again that connections are the secret of happiness, and that's true, and so important. But there's so much more, right? There's so much more. And so one of the things that I think is really worth calling attention to is the way in which our connections help us feel, right? How we can, when we share feelings with somebody, we feel them more fully, right? And this basic kind of point, right, that I hope we're all familiar with, that when we're sharing we're sharing emotionally with somebody, we're experience our feelings more robustly. I think it carries over to how it is that we can experience, you know, the important values in life, right? And we can more experiencing moments of joy and happiness more, and experiencing more, certainly, of psychological richness. So one of you know, the place I start thinking about psychological richness is how it kind of just spreads between people. And I think that many of us have our most interesting experiences in conversations with people, and we can just have a conversation and walk away just so moved. And So I feel like the interesting, really sparkles in between people, and that it can help us. It can help us feel these feelings when we need to. So I talk a lot about how helpful it is to really get to know and think through your connections, your own personal connections, and to understand kind of how it is that you are connecting and what you're doing for each other, so that for example, sometimes I find happiness really, I can get to a place where, I know I need it, and yet I really I struggle. And, I know the friend to call. I know the friend to call who will help me feel happier. And the same thing goes true with all of the, the important values in life, really, with psychological richness as well. I myself talk about in the book how I learned so much about psychological richness, right? Over the course of dating and marrying my husband, which all happened during the time I was researching this. And I drew so much and was influenced so much by the general spirit and, the sense of adventure and the kinds of things that he would just talk about. And I really, it caught me in many ways, but it really did, it taught me how to find the interesting. And now that's what I'm hoping to share with others.
Mm, mm. For some reason, COVID just popped in my head in relation to this, just thinking about the timing, and thinking about the resourcing, what thoughts you may have about how these ideas or how the research that you've been doing might have been, what kind of a difference might it have, what might it may have made, or can it make in the future if the research that you have been, developing and disseminating and coming out through your book becomes more widely known? Like, in what ways would you like to see this work impacting more broadly than the individual? Like,
Yeah,
in what
thank
ways
you.
can it be introduced more broadly?
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of different, areas in which number of different just areas, any area really, which is like impacting our life, right? That's kind of what I want to say, but that's not. But there are many different areas into which we can start to encourage awareness of psychological richness, and to start to encourage, practice and skill building. And you started off talking about COVID, and I was like, okay, well, I was going to start talking about, solitude skills, and
Mm,
actually, I spend a lot of time talking about that.
mm,
One of my colleagues is doing great work on this, and these are skills. They're so similar, right? The ability to sit with yourself and
mhm,
to have an interesting experience
mm,
is powerful. And
mm,
so I certainly think we can do a lot more to call attention to these areas in our life where we can, benefit from solitude. Other dimensions, I think that calling attention to experiences of being in nature, right? Nature is such a wonderful place to stimulate the thoughts, right? So having access to more opportunities for those kinds of things is helpful. And I've been thinking a lot about our education system in this context too, and it's kind of sad when I think about it, because I feel that children have this spirit so well, right? That children find the interesting everywhere they go, right? It's just they're curious, they bring their imagination to it, they're not structured, they're not pursuing anything, and so I just feel like I spend a lot of time, certainly in the book, also like reflecting and encouraging us to go back to when we were children. And I do think that, at some point, the educational system de-emphasizes those aspects of ourselves, and teaches us that they're not as important, right? That it's more important to siphon those off, right? And to start thinking and acting in a way that will be approved of, or will achieve something, or that will be seen as good. And I wish there were more avenues in our educational system where we don't shut kids down that way. And to more encouraging, right? I would love to talk to you all night about your improv scenarios. Like that would be I mean, I think that's a great example, right? Of things, of a way and a skill that we can have just to learn to be open and to engage without, without the baggage, right? Without structure, without focusing on ends. So I think that there are ways to bringing an emphasis on these skill development, right? Of the skills that will bring the interesting, that really do get siphoned out from many education systems. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about social wellness.
Yeah.
I think I shared with you, one of my master's degrees is in sociology and social policies. I'm always thinking about the implications for for how do we bring this out into the world.
Yeah.
And our program is actually launching a second master's program that's arts and coaching. So your work is very relevant to where we're going, which is how do we use avenues outside of the mental health realm, the coaching realm, in all kinds of venues. It could be in the workplace, it could be in wellness. And there's an international movement called the social prescribing movement. It's out of the UK originally. You may know about it. Started in the UK, where medical professionals started to prescribe walks in the park, going to feed the ducks, painting classes. Because if a doctor prescribes it, well, it's important then for your health. And there's been some really phenomenal data coming out of the studies from the positive impact on people's well-being, the diminishment of depression, for example. And that's beginning to, there's a movement now in the US, the social prescribing movement in the US, to sort of have some social impact. So I'm just seeing some of the keys there. And I'm curious for yourself, given where you've come and where you are in your own journey of the art of the interesting and your own psychological richness, where are you taking this work? What are your next steps? What are your curiosities and next moves?
Yeah. Thank you. First, can I just say how much I love the social prescribing movement and how helpful, and it's amazing that it's so gratifying to hear that we're finally speaking up and acknowledging the impact of these other areas of life within our minds. So that just makes me happy to hear that. Where am I going with this? I guess I go two ways, right? As a researcher, and as a person. So, as a researcher, I'm really interested in thinking about. I've turned a lot to think about boredom and its negative impacts on us, and to take it really more seriously, I think, than it often is. And I think that the flip side of recognizing how valuable and important interesting experiences are is recognizing how important boring experiences are. And in my research, I have extended this conversation to thinking about end-of-life care and to thinking about the importance of really recognizing the capacity to have an interesting experience and why that's something that we ought to preserve and to encourage and highlight, certainly throughout the life stages. I've also been thinking a lot academically about what it means to even engage in experience, and to think a little bit about where the lines are, right? Because a lot of what I'm saying for most of us is really like, open your mind, let it wander, let it free flow. And yet we know that for some individuals and for everyone, maybe on occasion, right, there's a point at which that dissipates and turns into a very unfocused, unsettled state. And so I'm really interested in learning more and trying to carve the lines out about what really it means to engage in this way without structure, because that's what I think is this big kind of piece here, that we're calling attention to the value of like unstructured cognitive engagement. And so it's something we haven't paid a lot of attention to, certainly in my field.
Yeah, I guess it's exactly. It's like, that's a whole other box that we're not going to open tonight,
yeah.
but just to acknowledge it. I mean, where this intersects with clinical practice would take us into a whole different domain,
Yeah.
you know, about unwanted thinking and unwanted thoughts and all of that part of it, which is a really important subject and really relevant.
Yeah.
And, you know, it brings up questions about the need for transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity, like the importance of the work that you're doing, and then what does this look like in real life? And, you know, how to get more discerning about the real effects of these practices, and when they work and when they don't, when they're kind of contraindicated in some ways.
Yeah.
And that certainly come from some of the research on meditation practices. You know, they're not for everyone. You know, basic meditation sitting practices are contraindicated in some instances.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot to learn there. Can I say about how I'm taking this away in my
Yes,
personal life?
please
Because
do. Yeah,
this is the
absolutely.
point. And you know, part of what I'm doing, a large part of what I'm hoping for this book is to really empower everybody to start looking at life in this new way. And I think that by understanding the role that these experiences can play, and by recognizing the role that they might already play in your life, uh, it's really affirming and empowering because they do occupy so much of life, and to know that, you know, this is good, right? That I don't have to just keep pursuing something else. That this is enough, you know, to have this really good, interesting experience, or to experience psychological richness. And I think one of the real takeaways, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of us, is to learn to be more comfortable with complicated emotions, and to really try to understand that, you know, the good life isn't an easy life, right? It's not. You can read too many happiness books out there and just think, this based on my personal experience, you can read so many happiness books out there that feel like there's something wrong with you because you're not there, and that, you know, that you can't get there. And, you know, I talk a lot about how, like, that we should expect that. That's just how our mental
And then
state
we've
of
got
happiness
social
works.
media sort of reinforces that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right.
And there's societal, you know, all of this stuff is really, you know, can set us up to feel pretty bad about how our lives are going. And so I think, and I hope that this has been empowered for me to think about it in this way, and to really own this aspect of myself and my life, and to prioritize it, and to seize onto it, and also just not to shy away from, you know, the hard stuff, and to, you know, the complicated emotions happen, right? Things happen, obstacles happen, and to know that you're like not, you know, sinking your chances of living a good life, I think is essential, and it certainly helps me to go through life in general, and to really be able to keep 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 striving and keep thinking about how it is still good, and to make it good. So
Lorraine, thank you so much. I think this is a good moment to open it up to Q&A.
sure.
Turn it over to our folks. Okay, and I'm looking at our questions. Question from the audience. How's the art of the interesting changed for you over the years? Have you heard from folks you know, and or have you read and or have read your book who have cultivated it in a way that surprises you?
It is so new that I am excited to hear how people are embracing it. You know, one thing that I know and I stress is that it's individual, right? How we all experience the interesting is depends on us as individuals, and our experiences, and what we're bringing to them. And so I think there are going to be so many ways, and there are so many ways already that people are having these experiences. One thing I have heard, and that was very gratifying from a reader, was just this notion that, you know, she's like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, and it's really just affirming and empowering to be able to label it, right? And to say, yeah, this is interesting, this is good. And my hope is that the more we do that, right, because we can all find, you know, the interesting in our lives, that these things are happening for us, and yet we don't really recognize them or value them. And so my hope really is just that more will be like that. And this reader, you know, she was just, it affirmed many of the things and then was inspiring her to do more and to find the interesting in life. And, you know, we can, I don't know. I mean, the question, I'm looking at the wording of the question. It's like, who have cultivated in a way that surprises you, you know? I don't know. I mean, I think I expect that we will find some really, that this will open up some really empowering pathways. And yet I don't know that it will be surprising to me because I know we're all capable of it. And it'll be fascinating to see us more flourish as individuals because that's what we'll be doing, right? We'll be to cultivate it is to bring more and to find what kind of really drives you and what passions you and to bring them out more. And I've seen that effect for myself. And I think that's empowering for all of us. And that will be exciting for me to see what happens when we bring all of ourselves to the picture. And
That's great. The next question. I found myself quite depressed in a pretty long season of adjustment. I don't know how to create the psychological richness I felt I had before I made some big life changes. What would you recommend to cultivate psychological richness in the season of change?
yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry you're struggling in this period of time, and I want you to know that, right, we all do it, and it is a season of change, and yet I also want to encourage you not to give up because it is a season of change. This is a great place to find psychological richness in your life, and I would recommend the little things. So, you know, so much of what we know about psychological richness is about the cumulative impact these experiences have on our life as we go on. And so the littlest experiences, you know, pull something out of your closet you haven't worn in ages and just, you know, you liked it at one point and put it on and see how that changes your day, right? Pick a new crayon and or pen color and write with that and see how that does it, right? These are things within our capacity, you know, even when life is really hard. These are little things within our capacity that we can do. So I would say start small, right? But keep doing it. And absolutely don't think that this is a time when it's not an option for you. And that's a really important, that's really important that uh that I think we all need to know, right? Like there's so much of this times or we go through hard times or we're having a change and we know, you know, happiness isn't just available to us and or something has uprooted us and, you know, it's too hard to find meaning. We don't have resources, but, you know, we don't just have to push through it. We can experience psychological richness during these difficult times. And I would say start where you can, start small and work big. A lot is about novelty. And so finding novelty in your life, introducing novelty in your life, even the littlest bits of novelty, right? Just noticing them, using that mindfulness 2.0, notice the novelty, give yourself the mindset, right? You're to bring to it where you're not evaluating, you're not judging, you're just giving your mind the space to blossom. And so start wherever you can and don't think you don't have to go high, right? The little things will start to trickle and they'll have an effect.
Thank you. I love that idea of like it's in the small things sometimes, the very small things. It's reminding me I was going through a hard time in the fall. Something had come up and I was going to a painting class. I'd been learning watercolors and I really could not focus on what I was supposed to learn in the class. And I thought, you know what, this isn't working for me today. I should leave. And the teacher said, don't leave. Take out your watercolors and just swatch your watercolors, each color one at a time. Everything changed, you know, and it was like such a small thing, but such a big thing.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes when we get stuck, it's hard to remind ourselves, though. It's, you know, to have someone else be the reminder, you know. And so thanks for putting that reminder out for anyone else who's struggling right now.
Yeah.
How does being in a flow state, like making pottery, playing music, or any arts practice, intersect with your research?
Yeah, well, I love learning about flow states. I love flow states. So flow states are, you know, they're this they're a very specific kind of what we're after here, right? They're a specific kind of place we're experiencing when we're bringing the right level of challenge to our sorry, where we are bringing the right level of skill to something that we're engaging in that challenges us, and then we can find this kind of sweet spot. And I think that flow examples, flow is an enjoyable, valuable experience that can deliver psychological richness, but sometimes we're so immersed in what we're doing that we get very in flow with the skill that we're exercising, right? So we're very focused on this skill, and we're completely immersed in it. Yet we're also, I think, a little bit, that state, I think, is more narrow than one that will be psychologically rich. And so it is, it has these aspects of it that I think are just one step away from delivering psychological richness. But with what I think is distinctive about flow is this kind of immersive way where you lose, self-consciousness, and you're really dialed into whatever, skill you're engaging. And wonderful state. I just psychological richness is going to be a little more unstructured, right? It's going to involve less focus, and so it's going to bring more of an open, less focused mind to your experiences. So I think that yeah, I've thought a lot about flow because it's such, I'm interested in valuable experiences, and that's one of them. And it has many of these factors that are distinctive to psychologically rich experiences. But I think that immersion and the way it can overtake us is something that that prevents it from being, a true model of psychological richness.
Thank you. Could you speak more of how your research in psychological richness, wellness, happiness has informed your journey as a parent? Are there any intentions you set in terms of sharing novel experiences with your child?
I love that question. Thank you. It's informed my journey as a parent on many different levels. And so I'll speak to the one you're directly asking about, which is, how intentional am I about bringing novel experiences or introducing my children to novelty, or really giving them the space to develop comfort by, within novelty. And so openness to experience is going to be it's a personality trait, but it's not fixed. We can develop it and we can encourage it. And the more open you are to experiences, the more easily you'll be able to experience the challenging stuff that delivers psychological richness. And so I think that as a parent, right, encouraging that openness to experience, even if it's just by like changing up dinner, right, or traveling somewhere else, or even just traveling to a different part of your city. So encouraging those new situations, and being, of course, with your child so that they can experience them safely, so that they can engage with them. So developing openness to experience, I think, is a really helpful and valuable thing that we can do for our children, for sure. There's a second level, though, and I'd like to, answer. It's not the one that you're asking directly about, but it's also in thinking about myself as a parent. And there's lots of research that came out a few years back that said, you know what, parenting doesn't make you happy. And I know that. I'm a parent. I know it's hard. It's hard. Parenting is hard. And yet it's interesting, and it's really interesting. And we have a joke in our household. We have a blended family. People have moved out now, but there were a time when it was just crazy. And my husband and I would just joke, at least it's not boring. And that little things, but it was just like, yeah, you're right. I would way rather have this than not. And even as chaotic and hectic as it is, it's not boring. And that speaks worlds to me.
So it just sounds like it's like dethroning the kind of American ideal that's enshrined, in the only constitution in the world that says you have a right to happiness. Like, what a thing to put on people, a burden.
Yeah. It isn't a burden. It just doesn't work like that. There's other things that are good. So yeah.
Right. Okay, next one. Someone Okay, this is right on point. Someone recently asked me if I'm happy in the city I've just moved to. As someone from a non-Western culture, it was the first time I actually thought about whether I was happy, right? Just right on target. Thank you for the question. How would you define psychological richness, and how centered does the pursuit of happiness need to be in this discourse?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And thank you for sharing your perspective, right? Like why is the Western culture so focused on happiness? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of explanations. Yet I think it's a mistake. And I think that one thing that I, learned throughout my research on happiness was how futile it is to really pursue it. And it's, the more we pursue it, the less happier we're going to be. We can expand on that in many different levels, but it's just, I don't think it's the type of thing that we should be going about actively pursuing. My take on happiness is that it's wonderful and we should enjoy it when we have it, but we just really shouldn't stress about it when we don't. And so that's where psychological richness can play a big role, because it is distinct from happiness, which means, it's available even when you're not happy. And it is something that we can bring to our lives and is something that we can create, right? We can create psychological richness within our experiences, within our minds, and just by bringing a certain kind of perspective to it. And that's what we can get, and that's what we should be getting. And it's all about cultivating this mindset so that we will find these and create these on our own, and stop pursuing happiness and just stop pursuing things more generally. It's very effective for some projects, but for a lot, it's not. And I think very often when pursuing things, we just get stuck in this mindset of focus that excludes all of the potential for interesting things to happen. So,
Right. Final question I think we have here. Who might someone seek guidance from to deepen into exploring their own art of the interesting? For example, therapists or coaches? Sure, we got lots of good CIIS people you could consider.
I would say Shoshana. We should start taking some improv classes with her and experiencing that. Yeah, I think it's right now this is a new thing, but I think the ways to go it are really to go to the creative realms and to look at those who are already doing and thriving on engaging, firing up our minds in these ways. And so if just today we are like looking at like who can help me open up my minds in this way, find a creative arts person, find a theater, go to improv, right? Do something like that. Like, so if we're looking for direct guidance, I would look in that avenue. There's going to be others, of course. And I would also, like on the opposite side, I go back to those solitude skills and the ability just to learn skills that you can use in your intentional time alone that will enhance them. And so there are a lot of resources out there and a lot of books we can read and guidance we can get on solitude practices. And I think that is really helpful. It's one step away from psychologically richness, and it'll help us fine tune those skills, that are really going to be the ones that will allow us to enhance our lives no matter where we are. Because if we can do them in solitude, right, we can do them even when we're around other difficult things.
And we have a few more questions that have come in. How does mindfulness too relate to decentering?
Yeah, thank you. I think it might very well go in another trajectory. I think that mindfulness 2.0 is actually about kind of focusing and centering on some target and allowing your mind to expand on that. So if I'm getting that sense of decentering right, I think it's a different kind of trajectory. And it is one that is, we do want the mindfulness 2.0 is going to encourage us to take our minds, away from ourselves and out, and give us the opportunity to engage with what's out there. And the mindfulness 2.0 is going to allow us to focus on something that will trigger then us to have this experience.
Thank you. How do you find the body reacts to being in states of psychological richness?
Yeah, thank you. I think it awakens. I think if there's a sense in which we feel more alive in our bodies, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about experiencing psychological richness, right? It's not, one basic level of pleasure or anything like that, but it's this sense of feeling alive and activated. And so I personally feel more embodied when during psychologically rich experience, because I do find that it allows me to operate from this greater kind of sense of self, and it really affirms me and my body and all of it. And so I just have to go back to that idea of like we feel more alive, and I hope we know it. I hope we've had experience of that somewhere, but that's what I've experienced to be the impact.
Thank you. You've talked about psychological richness. I'm curious, what would psychological poverty look like?
Yeah, thank you. It looks like a lack of engagement. It looks very boring, and so I would describe psychological poverty, and I love that term that way of thinking about it, as a state where we are not allowing our mind to engage on different levels, right? That doesn't mean we might not be using our minds, right? So to draw on one of my own personal experiences, I feel after I've gotten through a writing project, or I've really focused and done something, even, with my mind engaging, that is engaging, but very structured and very focused and very much aiming, that I will often, once I'm out of that mode, I will find that I feel impoverished a little bit, because I'm focusing only on one part. And so I think that psychological poverty is just going to be a lack of engagement, a lack of kind of your all aspects of your mind firing. And again, I want to encourage us to think about, we're really used to thinking about using our mind in these structured, rational ways, and there's so much more that our minds can do, and so it's unstructured and it's free flowing. And so whenever there's a lack of that, right, that's going to be a situation where we are impoverished. And and I would also encourage you to think about about being bored. I think that when we're bored, it's because, we kind of, our minds are striving for engagement, but we can't, right? We can't do anything with it. We can't activate. And so that feels like psychological impoverishment to me.
Lorraine, that was the last question. So I'm just wondering if there's any final thoughts you would like to share.
Yeah, I hope everyone found something here, whether it was affirming what you already know, or whether it was encouraging you to go out and see the world a little bit differently. But that's really what I'm hopeful that we can do here, that we can seize control of our lives, that we can harness our ability to enhance our lives, and that we will. So I encourage you to go for it, whether it's little steps, big steps, doesn't matter. It all adds up. And so I hope I've just inspired you to go for it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being in this conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and the audience for their questions, which were really helpful.
Wonderful. Go out and buy the book, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.